Welcome to the deep dive. We've got a really interesting set of sources today, all looking at, well, a pretty huge social topic.
Yeah, it's about these contemporary progressive movements and how they're affecting what many people call traditional values.
Exactly. And the pace of it all? I mean, if you felt like the ground rules are shifting fast, how we talk about family or the country or even just loyalty,
Uh-huh.
that's exactly the kind of tension this material digs into.
Mm-hmm.
The sources actually describe things like family norms, marriage, patriotism.
Uh-huh.
They say it's changing at a dizzying pace.
Making it feel like contested ground is the phrase they use.
Right. So before we dive deeper, maybe we should clarify what the sources mean by traditional values.
Good point. They define them as sort of the core principles that communities have relied on for a long time. Things like loyalty to family, faith, the value of hard work, and, respecting cultural continuity. The basics, really.
Okay, got it. So the mission for us today is pretty clear. We're looking at this central question that comes up in the material. Are all these shifts just about adapting those old values for today's world, modernizing them?
Or is something more fundamental going on?
Yeah, or is the aim, as these sources seem to suggest, more like dismantling those foundations altogether?
That's the crux of it.
So we're here to unpack the arguments, the strategies involved, and what the implications might be, all based on the material we've reviewed.
And it's interesting because the sources argue these shifts aren't just happening randomly. They trace them back to some specific ideas, intellectual roots, mainly from academia.
Okay, let's unpack that. If we want to understand this shift, we need to look at the ideas driving it. The material highlights two main ideological drivers for this progressive framework. What are they?
Well, the first one they identify is critical theory. The source explains this really took shape in universities, and its core idea was to constantly question power structures, social norms, traditions, institutions.
Questioning everything, basically.
Pretty much. The underlying idea being that these structures often, maybe inherently, oppress certain groups, so they need constant challenging.
Okay, that's one. What's the second?
The second is intersectionality and identity politics. This framework, as described, sees society less as a unified whole and more as a kind of ongoing struggle. It's structured by power dynamics between different groups, often framed as oppressed versus oppressor.
And it focuses on how different identities, race, gender, class intersect.
Exactly. How those interceptions shape someone's experience of power or lack of it.
That's a key distinction. So critical theory questions the system, and intersectionality focuses on the groups within that system and their power relationships.
That's a good way to put it, yeah.
So what happens when you apply these theories to really established institutions, like, say, the family or religion, or even the nation state?
Well, according to the material, the result is increasing calls to fundamentally change them, or even abolish them.
Abolish them? That sounds pretty radical.
It does, but the logic presented is, if these institutions are seen mainly as tools of oppression, then redefining or dismantling them becomes, well, a progressive goal. The sources specifically mention the traditional family unit, organized religion, and the idea of a unified nation-state as key targets. They're seen as containers of that old traditional power.
Okay, this is where it starts to feel really tangible, right?
Yeah,
Moving from academic theory to everyday life.
precisely.
Because if the ideas are about challenging power, you'd expect to see that play out in specific areas. Cultural battlegrounds, as you called them earlier.
That's exactly where the sources go next. The friction really happens when these ideas meet long-standing cultural norms.
Let's start with maybe the most personal one,
Hmm.
the family. The sources spend quite a bit of time on how its definition is shifting. What's the change described there?
They explain that the progressive viewpoint, as outlined in the material, is moving away from that fixed traditional model, mother, father, child.
Towards something more flexible.
Yes, exactly. Flexibility is key. The idea is to separate gender and specific roles from how you raise kids or have a partnership. The goal, as framed in the source, is liberation from what are seen as patriarchal or heteronormative constraints, so family structures without fixed gender roles.
And the flip side of that, which the sources also note, is a concern that this focus on flexibility might reduce the sort of stability that the traditional roles were seen to provide.
That's the tension they highlight, yes.
Yeah.
If the old way prioritized continuity, maybe hierarchy, for stability, the newer approach prioritizes individual choice, emotional fulfillment, which, the sources argue, can sometimes introduce instability.
Right. Okay, let's shift gears to education. The sources call schools battlegrounds. That's strong language. What's the fight about, according to this material?
Well, the argument presented is that, especially in public schools, there are big curriculum changes happening that are meant to embed these progressive ideologies.
Any specific examples cited?
Yeah, quite specific ones. Things like sex and gender education programs that introduce concepts of fluid identity pretty early on, and also how history is taught.
Ah, history. Always a contentious area. What's the change there?
The sources say history is increasingly being framed not just as complex events, but primarily through the lens of systemic oppression, often portraying Western civilization itself as fundamentally flawed, needing radical change. The material argues this is basically critical theory applied directly in the classroom.
So it's not just about adding diverse perspectives. It's about structuring the whole narrative around power and oppression.
That's the interpretation offered in the sources,
Yeah.
yes, that institutions themselves are inherently tied to these problematic dynamics.
And if those ideas are being taught in schools, then we absolutely have to talk about the main amplifier,
Yeah.
media.
Yeah, media and entertainment are huge here. They're described as powerful tools for normalization. The sources point out how narratives in movies, TV shows, even video games often carry these underlying progressive themes. It's subtle sometimes. Characters, storylines, they can reframe what society sees as normal without a big debate.
Just by showing it over and over again.
Exactly. Repetition is key. Presenting new norms about family, identity, history as just, well, the way things are now. The sources suggest it's a kind of soft power approach to shifting culture. It changes expectations gradually.
That makes sense.
Uh.
And it raises a big question. Once these cultural shifts take hold, they must spill over into other areas, right? Like the economy and politics.
Absolutely. It's not just about stories. It connects to how we spend money, how laws are made.
So connecting to the bigger picture.
Yeah.
The analysis then moves into the economy. The sources talk about the rise of the woke economy.
Yeah.
Can you define that a bit more based on the material?
Sure. It refers to corporations increasingly aligning themselves with progressive social issues.
How do they actually do that alignment, according to the sources? What are the mechanisms?
Well, things like ESG scores are mentioned, environmental, social, governance criteria. Companies might feel pressure or choose to adopt certain stances, making public statements on social issues, running marketing campaigns tied to specific agendas, basically weaving these social metrics into their business model, sometimes alongside profit.
And what's the suggested outcome of that?
The sources point to a potential contradiction. It might align the company with one part of the market, but it also risks alienating other customers, maybe more traditional ones, who feel their values are being ignored or even attacked by these brands.
A tension between market share and ideological alignment.
That's the tension described, yes.
Okay, so that's the economic side. What about the political ramifications? The sources seem pretty focused on changes in governance, specifically mentioning legislative and judicial activism.
Yes. The material argues that progressive views on rights and equality are increasingly shaping policy, and not just through new laws passed by legislatures, but also through reinterpreting existing laws, through the courts and regulatory agencies.
Judicial activism, as they term it.
That's the term used, yeah. The sources see it as using the legal and regulatory systems to push policy changes, sometimes bypassing the slower, more contentious legislative process.
And this affects a wide range of areas.
Apparently, yes. The sources mention impacts on everything from healthcare access, like gender transition services, to workplace diversity rules, and even big questions around free speech boundaries. The argument is that it's a way to advance ideological goals potentially faster than democratic debate might allow.
And that brings us right to a really critical point raised in the material: free expression. If the rules are changing fast and the courts are active, what happens to people who disagree? Can they still speak freely?
This is a major concern highlighted in the sources. They point to things like cancel culture and deplatforming.
Phenomena we hear a lot about.
Exactly. The analysis suggests that in this charged environment, the push for social progress can sometimes mean shutting down voices that challenge the new norms. And the sources frame this as a serious issue. They ask whether this suppression of dissenting views, even if done in the name of progress, might actually undermine the open discourse needed for a healthy society.
A society built on the free exchange of ideas.
Precisely. It questions if we're losing that foundation.
Okay, that's a really thorough look at the analysis of the shifts: cultural, economic, political. Which brings us to the final part of the material. It doesn't just critique, it offers some thoughts on a potential path forward for people concerned about all this.
Right. The sources lay out a kind of three-part framework for responding. The first part emphasizes seeking common ground.
So even with all this disagreement, find something shared to build on.
That's the idea. The material encourages looking for those universal principles most people can still agree on. Things like basic human dignity, fairness, the value of community, using those as a starting point to rebuild dialogue, maybe some trust.
Okay, common ground first. What's the second approach?
The second is what they call grassroots resistance.
Which sounds like,
It points to groups already forming and taking action, often at a very local level, sometimes kind of under the radar. These efforts, as described, are focused on actively preserving traditions, maybe rebuilding family or community structures based on older models, trying to restore balance from the bottom up.
so a kind of local counter movement to the bigger institutional changes.
That seems to be the picture painted, yeah. Community-driven responses.
And the third part, you mentioned the sources stress. This one is key for the listener,
Yes, and this is individual agency.
meaning it comes down to each person.
Ultimately, yes. The material really concludes that the power lies with the individual, with you, the listener. It encourages you to actively question the narratives you encounter from media, schools, companies, to assess information critically, and, maybe most importantly, to consciously decide which values you want to live by and promote in your own community. The idea is that the future isn't set. It's shaped by countless individual choices.
Wow. That really does wrap up the core tension we've been talking about, this clash between rapid social change and these very long-standing principles.
It does, and connecting it to the big picture, the sources really leave you with this thought. Society's future isn't predetermined by theories or corporate decisions alone. These battlegrounds are real, yes, but the path forward, according to this analysis, is influenced by your own actions and choices.
So we end with that provocative question the material itself raises. Will traditional values manage to adapt and survive in this changing landscape?
Or will they perhaps be fundamentally redefined or even washed away?
And the implication from the sources is that the answer, at least in part, begins with the values you choose to live and defend. Something to think about. Definitely engage critically with all this information.